Enforcing the Banishment Proclamation against the Catholic Church, a practical guide to cleansing your local temple, by Kevin D. Annett. That old troublemaker and community organiser Saul Alinsky once said that no public action was worth doing if the people doing it didn't have fun. More to the point, he elaborated that sustained mockery of the powerful, like by occupying their sacred turf, was something they had no defence against. The horrified reaction of Catholic bishops everywhere to our occupation of their churches during Sunday services seems to bear that out, Saul. So it's delightful to know that we few in the vanguard of a growing army of justice for children have a way to really grab the clerics where it hurts. This article is an accompanying piece to our just issued proclamation of banishment against the Roman Catholic Church. It's a sort of how-to manual with practical hints of ways to sustain our campaign to expose and open up these churches long past the day when the banishment is pronounced. The fly in the elephant's ear. First, a word on our general strategic position. Our forces are like a fly in an elephant's ear, tiny but lethal in the right moment and place. That's because we have the truth, solid evidence, and a potential army of witnesses on our side. Our strongest weapon is to always stand loudly and clearly on that evidence, and to keep shoving it in the face of the Church and the public in ways they don't expect. The Catholic Church Incorporated is the oldest corporation in history, and therefore the most vulnerable and the least flexible. We are the opposite. We have nothing to lose, are adaptable, and completely unpredictable. That's how guerrilla movements historically operate and win against seemingly unbeatable tyrants. The best example I like about what our little guerrilla groups can do is how a dozen or so of us in Canada forced the Indian residential schools genocide into the political and media mainstream in the spring of 2007, simply by occupying churches in Vancouver and Toronto during their Sunday services. And years before that, in the fall of 1995, by picketing the United Church head office in Vancouver, I forced its top officials to prematurely issue a public statement denying that children were killed in their Indian schools, even before I had accused them of causing such deaths. In short, a big enemy properly goaded will cause its own undoing, since it knows it's guilty and is operated by lawyers and bureaucrats whose bottom line is a purely financial one. That is, calculating everything on the basis of what they stand to lose. Practical steps: be creative and have a ball. What we're starting around the world is an enormous reclamation movement. We are telling the Catholic Church to get off our land or conform to the will of the people. We are taking over churches and making them open public space. And from the reaction so far, including from over 300 ecstatic volunteers in 7 countries, we have struck a chord in the public imagination. Our worst enemy now is our own fear and lack of imagination. First, about fear. It's what religion relies on, especially Catholicism. Most of us have been conditioned to fear churches and clergy and assume that those cloistered altars and pews are somehow sacred and untouchable realms. We're even told by some statutes that to disrupt a church service is an offence under the law. In practice, that's a statute that cops will never enforce because they know it's rubbish. After all, what is disruption? Someone challenging a priest or questioning his interpretation of scripture? Maybe an old granny should be jailed for coughing during a priestly homily. In our case, our occupation of churches during the service has always been done in a respectful and a non-violent way. It's always the priests who resort to violence in that situation. For instance, I was personally grabbed and put into an arm lock by an enraged cleric at the Holy Rosary Cathedral in Vancouver once when I stood peacefully with 50 others bearing a banner, "All the children need a proper burial." The priest's absurdity was obvious to everyone in the pews that day, and in fact a few minutes later the whole congregation stood reverentially as we passed by with our banner. Of course, what we're planning this week and beyond is more permanent than a one-time occupation. We will be actively disestablishing the Catholic Church and taking over their premises, and for that we need serious and wider community support. We will be creating that support by breaking the ice and naming what is and doing something. Most people hang back and are secretly inspired and thrilled by the doers, no matter how risky is the doing. What gets them on board is when they see that the doing is happening more than once. So above all, we need to sustain our effort. But here are 2 very simple things that will guarantee a community involvement and even media interest: music and humour. Some folks in Vancouver are planning a public frock-off in a local Catholic church, where known child rapists and other crooks among the clergy will be named and escorted from the premises. They're asking everyone to show up and witness the frock-off and to bring drums, instruments and banners for the event. A local singer friend of mine in Vancouver plans to sing from the pulpit a little ditty she composed called I Saw Jesus Today, which reminds people how you won't find Christ in a church but out among the suffering. In the coming days, an Aboriginal women's group in Canada plans to occupy and open up their local Catholic church as a free daycare and safe house for threatened people. Wonderfully appropriate when you think of it, considering the role of the same church in creating generations of tortured Native women and men. I love the image of 100 dark-skinned kids running round a fancy Catholic sanctuary. The sky's the limit in these actions. Some survivors groups in Europe plan to open up Catholic churches as the site of street corner tribunals, where victims can name the crimes and all the criminals. And in Canada and the USA, our people will often rely on simple infiltration of Sunday services, sitting amongst the parishioners and speaking with them, or mounting the pulpit to address the congregation. Pulpit seizures are a fine and honourable tradition, after all. The early Quakers and Ranters in England did it nicely, inciting churchgoers to seek God in the world and their neighbours, and not in idolatrous temples. And speaking of temples and their cleansing, Jesus himself, on the one occasion he was ever in a church, used that tactic that we'd recommend as well. Need we say more? What to do if? OK, so your cheerful hordes have entered a church and camped out, read the Banishment and been told by the grumpy ushers to leave. You don't, so they call the cops. Now what? Well, going into a church isn't a crime. It's your public right. Especially since those of you who pay taxes are actually funding the place. And that makes it public space. And that's the first thing you tell the boys in blue when they arrive. Sorry, officers, but this is a religious gathering in public place, and we're all worshipping what really matters. The cops and anyone, in fact, can get in trouble under the law if they disturb a religious gathering. We found that at this point, the gendarmes either leave or stand around looking helpless, in which case go ahead and start educating them about the crimes of the church they've shown up to protect. And that's a key point. The police are sworn to be public servants and not the private security force for institutionalised child rapists. So tell them that. And tell them you're deputising them to be public peace officers who'll protect your rights to gather peacefully inside and outside the church. We did that in Vancouver churches on 3 occasions, each time the cops left. But life is unpredictable, and what if the police or some Catholic thugs try using force to evict you? Unlikely. The church's chief concerns are their public image, their property and their revenue. Violence in the church threatens all 3 of those. So stand pat on your rights, your peaceful occupation, and the truth that the church killed and still harms children, and you will retain the moral and practical high ground. In the long run. Displacing and replacing the church is our long-term aim. These banishments and occupations are merely our opening salvos. On those occasions where native groups in Canada have ordered the Catholic Church off their land, the church has complied, since it knows it was squatting there illegally all along. In the long run, we will be relying on such evictions like the ones ordered by hereditary elder Kiapalano of the Squamish Nation, who in March 2008 issued eviction notices to all of the churches that killed his relatives in residential schools, the Church of England, the Catholic and the United Church. For now, our 10-measure statement, which was issued on May the 4th, is what needs to be broadcast to Catholics everywhere during our occupations. That is, the Catholic folks can stay as long as they agree to these 10 steps. This will help force churchgoers to choose and will help launch a new sort of reformation if history tells us anything. For now, be bold, imaginative and film everything that you do and post it on YouTube. Send us the links. We will be spreading news and updates to you all. Remember, what you do today will save the life and the sanity of a child tomorrow, and may even resurrect the memory and hopes of the little ones murdered by imperial Christianity. Carry it on. The world is watching.